Welcome to the Connor's Corner segment of Ask the Lawyer. With me right now is General John Scales, who wrote a book about one of the most controversial generals of the American Civil War, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Welcome to Connor's Corner.
Thank you.
Nathan Bedford Forrest, one, who was he? And two, why did you decide to write a book about his campaigns?
To talk about who he was essentially the poor boy made good. His family was very poor. He was born in Tennessee. He was the oldest, and his father died when he was still a young teenager, and he had to support the family. He first moved to work for his uncle in horse trading and learned that, and by this time they had moved to Mississippi. And then he was successful at that, so he branched out into what was the most lucrative market, slave trading, and then from that branched out into property and became actually one of the richest men in Tennessee before age 40. He served as alderman twice in Memphis, Tennessee, and was a very prominent citizen. And then, of course, when the war came, he signed up as a private, and he ended up as a lieutenant general. His opponent, General Sherman, thought that he was, in fact, one of the most extraordinary people that was in the war on either side. So I'm sitting here retired. I've read biographies of him, as of many other Civil War characters, but I happen to live in an area where everything he did was within 300 miles. And I'm also extremely interested in why was he so extraordinary? How did he do this? And what were the surrounding circumstances? So therefore, you can get a lot of biographies, but the biographies don't necessarily have that sort of detail. You know, why it really happened, how it unfolded, what led to this, that, and the other. So I couldn't find the book that I wanted to read, so I ended up writing one.
Did General Forrest have any military background before the war?
No. I caveat that very slightly by saying that he actually volunteered for the Mexican War, and he joined a unit. But by the time that the unit got to Texas, they fell apart, and they weren't needed anymore. The war was over, so he had to work his way to get back home.
That doesn't sound like that much of a background. You know, that's not much of a resume to become a lieutenant general. So he enlists as a private. How does he become an officer?
Well, it's very easy. I told you he was one of the most prominent guys in Tennessee, one of the wealthiest. So, of course, the governor, Isham Harris, knew exactly who he was. And he heard that he'd signed up as a private, and he sent him a letter, and I wouldn't doubt that there was some sort of underground correspondence anyway, but he offered him a commission as a lieutenant colonel if he undertook to raise a battalion of cavalry. So he did.
What's his first action?
Well, the first action was an encounter with a gunboat on the river. He tried to ambush a tin-clad gunboat that was moving up and down the river, and he had a 4-pounder cannon, which was inadequate to the purpose, but he tried to ambush it. The gunboat was warned, so they exchanged fire, and neither side ended up drawing any blood at all. The gunboat was called the Conestoga. All right. But anyway, and that was on the Cumberland River is what I'm talking about. So that was his first action, but that was really not much. The first time that he actually clashed with a Union Army detachment was in the village of Sacramento, Kentucky. This was in December of 1861. And he managed to disperse the detachment. He actually outnumbered them. There were about 150 to 160 Union soldiers, and he had over 200 guys, although because he had gotten advance word they were there. He had galloped his horses, and when he first got there, he was outnumbered. And the Union cavalry unit attacked him. And but meanwhile, some more of his guys were coming up, so he launched, seemingly instinctively, what's called a double envelopment. He sent guys around to each side, and as soon as the Union cavalry saw that, then he charged right down the middle, and they broke and ran.
So what's the next step? I guess we got Fort Donelson, or was that it?
Well, that was the next major thing. He actually patrolled that frontier in Kentucky for a couple of months. When Fort Henry fell, the units that he belonged to, he actually was attached to General Clark, who was in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. They were all ordered to Fort Donelson, and so that was his next major action.
So what was his activity, in the Fort Donelson campaign?
When he arrived, he was actually the senior cavalry commander there, so he assumed command of the cavalry. Meanwhile, General Grant was moving cross-country between Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, Fort Henry being on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson being on the Cumberland River, but they're relatively close together there. So he arrived there, and his first activity was he drove off a scouting party of Union cavalry, and then the next day, the main body of the Union Army started appearing, so he launched a delay action that delayed a infantry brigade with attached cavalry and artillery. It delayed their movement forward for some time, and then he was ordered back into the entrenchments after that. After that, he deployed his guys against some sharpshooters. He observed the Fort Donelson cannon turning back the Union fleet. And then when the Confederates tried to break out of Fort Donelson, he was on the far left flank of the attack. Now, he didn't really have much opposition there, although the first shot was fired at one of his cavalrymen. And as the attack advanced, and it was successful for a while, he was pinched out, more or less. On his left, there was a stream that was flooded, and so he had to kind of circle around, and he helped take a battery and also helped the attack of the infantry for a while. That attack was successful, but there was some misunderstanding between the general officers involved, only one of which was particularly competent. And so while they were arguing what to do, Grant arrived on the scene. He had been over with the river boats a distance away and restored part of the position. So anyway, when that was discovered, the generals sat around and said, well, we think we're going to have to surrender. It was very cold. There had been some snow and the ground was frozen, and they didn't think their guys could survive because they'd have to get out through the swamps. Well, Forrest asked, he asked General Pillow, who was one of the generals, and said, I want permission to break out. I didn't bring my people here to surrender. And so he did, and he, in the middle of that, found that Grant had not yet restored a complete siege of Fort Donelson, that there was still an open pathway out. But anyway, he and his most of his men made it out. A few of them didn't get the word.
When do you believe that Forrest really started to show his greatness, or when did people recognize it?
Well, that was his first real claim to fame right there, breaking out of Donelson. And so his name became known. I would say that he was just known as one of a number of very successful Confederate cavalry generals for quite a while. Now, nothing he had done up to this point had any real effect on the larger war itself, as you might imagine. But fairly soon afterwards, he fought at Shiloh. Nothing really extraordinary there one way or another, except he covered the retreat. After the 2 days of Shiloh, The next day after that, he was part of the rear guard. And General Sherman was the guy in charge of pursuit. And so there was a small engagement called Fallen Timbers, which was the only time they actually met on the battlefield. Of course, Sherman had overwhelming power. He had a couple of brigades, and Forrest had only 300 cavalrymen. But Forrest managed to disperse his advanced guard and came very close to capturing or killing Sherman. And Sherman made the comment after the war that had Forrest not run out of rounds in his pistol before he got to him, that would have been the end of Sherman's war. But he still wasn't very famous, but he was recognized as a very active and capable officer at the cavalry regiment level, which by this time he was a regimental commander. But he got picked to be a brigadier general of cavalry under special circumstances. East Tennessee was occupied by the Confederacy, but that summer, we're talking the summer of 1862, it was under threat by almost 5 times the number of Union soldiers moving slowly towards Chattanooga. And the Confederate cavalry in that region, 4 regiments, were all bickering with each other. The colonels were bickering with each other, and no one was in charge. They said, "Well, we need a good guy and make him a general and put him over this." And so Forrest's name came up. Several people recommended him, and he went to East Tennessee and took over the cavalry there. And probably one of the most important things he did, which is not well known, is he was given the mission of delaying this Union Army, this almost 50,000 people headed toward Chattanooga, for a month. And he accomplished that by operating behind Union lines for an entire month. He took Murfreesboro, he raided against Nashville, and he stayed back there. And it so occupied the commander, General Buell, that between that and trying to keep the railroads repaired and upgrading them, that Buell made almost no further progress towards Chattanooga until a Confederate army was able to arrive there. So he didn't necessarily become famous because of that, but it was an extraordinary stroke, because instead of Chattanooga falling as it would have in late summer of 1862, it did not fall for a year until a year later.
General Scales, we need to take a short break. You're listening to Ask the Lawyer with me, Mike Connors, talking to General John Scales on Nathan Bedford Forrest.
He will be arguably one of the most controversial soldiers in the Civil War, one of the best soldiers in the Civil War if he's on your side. Personally, in battle, this is in hand-to-hand confrontation, he will kill at least 30 men. He will even kill one of his officers that tries to assassinate him. And he kills you in a way you don't like to die.
That was one of our favorite historians, Ed Barrs, commenting on Nathan Bedford Forrest, who is the subject of our interview with General John Scales. Let's maybe get to one of the most controversial parts, later on in the war, Fort Pillow. What can you tell the listening audience about Fort Pillow, and what do you think was the truth of the matter?
All right, Fort Pillow was a occupied outpost on the Mississippi River. It had originally been built to be defended by 10,000 people, and it had been built by the Confederacy. Sherman had ordered it abandoned because it was not serving any useful purpose, but because it was used to smuggle cotton, obviously in high demand in the North for the mills up there, that order somehow had not been carried through. There were 2 Union units at Fort Pillow. There was a U.S. colored troops, 6th Artillery, had a few people less than 300 soldiers. They stayed basically at the fort and manned the artillery pieces that were on the high ground above the river. There were another 300 or so, 13th Tennessee U.S., who were doing who were basically marauding against the countryside, is the best way to put it. They had a fairly bad reputation, and they were the ones that were grabbing the cotton. There was a lot associated with them. So the Fort Pillow was identified by the people in West Tennessee, and this was in 1864, April of 1864, was identified by the people there, who were mostly Confederate sympathizers, as, hey, this is a nest of people that are performing theft, murder, they're burning houses, etc., etc. Could you please clean it out? This is to Forrest. So as his last act before he went back to Mississippi, he was up there recruiting and letting his people visit home. So as his last act, he went over to do that. He sent about 1,500 people there. Okay, the garrison of the fort saw them coming, and they retreated. The U.S. colored troops stayed in the fort right above the river. The 13th Tennessee actually stayed about a quarter-mile straight-line distance in front of them. When Chalmers, who was Forrest's subordinate, got there, he set up, basically surrounded it and did a recon. Then when Forrest got there in the morning, he also did a reconnaissance. Now, Chalmers had put snipers on high ground, and they had actually killed the fort commander, a Major Booth, who was inside the fort. And they killed a bunch of people because, unfortunately, the fort was commanded by higher ground. That is, the snipers on higher ground could see what was going on inside there and shoot people moving around. So while Forrest was doing his reconnaissance, his horse was shot from under him, and it fell on him and injured him. Okay, not greatly, but slightly. That becomes important in a moment. But anyway, so he ordered an attack. Forrest ordered an attack on the outer line where the 13th Tennessee was, which was actually, it's called the inner line there because there was another line of breastworks much further out that they didn't even try to defend. All right, that was taken almost immediately, and the 13th Tennessee retreated back to the fort on the high ground above the river. Okay, now the terrain there is very what you would call highly dissected. That is, there are a lot of ravines and everything like that. Right now, it's also very wooded, but at the time they had cut all the trees down, so there were a lot of visibility, but from the fort, you couldn't see in the ravines. So Forrest had his guys move forward, in some cases to within 100 yards of the fort itself. And then he sent in a flag of truce and offered to surrender. You will be treated as prisoners of war, et cetera, et cetera. While the flag of truce was flying, there was some stuff on the river. There were river boats. There had been one gunboat that had been bombarding Forrest, but with little effect. And there was a boat full of troops that was heading in evidently to reinforce. So Forrest moved some people down to the riverbank to engage them should they try to land. But as soon as they saw people Confederates down there, they sheered off. So anyway, all this was going on during the flag of truce. The second in command, Major Bradford, sent back kind of an ambiguous message. And Forrest, this won't do, and said, I need a yes or no. And Bradford came back and said, we're not going to surrender. There's a whole backstory behind why he thought he could hold the place, but at any rate, he was mistaken. So Forrest moved back to this high ground a quarter mile away where everybody could hear his bugler, and sent the word out, when you hear the bugle, go over the wall. And that's what happened. Forrest himself, because of his injury and everything, would not arrive into the fort until about between 10 and 15 minutes after the assault had occurred. Okay, the guys who were assaulting had single-shot rifles, as did the people inside. but they were cavalrymen, dismounted cavalrymen, and they had pistols. So they went over the wall and they shot everything in sight. Once they got in there, some soldiers, both white and black, some Union soldiers surrendered. And some, the number unknown, were shot down in cold blood. There was a lot of controversy. Later, it was claimed that they had the garrison had cussed out the attackers. That's not abnormal, but it might have made people mad. But this is one of the first times anywhere that the U.S. colored troops had actually fought a battle. One of the first. And there were certainly people on the Confederate side that didn't that murdered these surrendering soldiers, black and white. But as I say, this was 4:00 in the afternoon, and there had been shooting all day. So a certain number of the casualties certainly were caused by that shooting, and a certain number were caused by when the guys came over the wall. Now, the garrison never surrendered. They retreated down to the riverbank. They did not realize that Forrest had people down there, and so they retreated right into an ambush. Bottom line, 300 more or less of the Union soldiers were killed. A certain number wounded, and a certain number marched away. Some of the people who were wounded were put on a riverboat the next day and given back to the Union, that is. The unwounded and slightly wounded were marched away as prisoners. That included both black and white troops. There was not an order to slaughter anybody, but in the melee it occurred, and also one would have to say because some of the Confederate soldiers went far beyond what they should have and shot down people in cold blood. So all of that happened. As I say, Forrest didn't really arrive but until 10 or 15 minutes after the fort had been overrun. He wasn't even aware of any of these details because the artillery mounted in the fort. He went over to the Parrott, the 10-pounder Parrott cannon there, and was trying to turn it around to engage the riverboat that had been bombarding him all day. And that's what he was paying attention to.
Did he ever write about Fort Pillow? Did he ever defend himself, defend his troops?
Well, personally, although he was literate, he hated to write things. He would have his staff write things. Afterwards, all right, this became a big deal. And the Union commander in Memphis sent a letter down saying, do you mean to offer no quarter? This is in spite of the fact that half the people did survive. It wasn't a no quarter situation. And he replied, it got kind of ugly, and he replied, says, tell me who you claim kill people in cold blood, and I will prosecute them. And they went back and forth, and cooler heads prevailed on both sides. But I don't think he ever understood or was willing to accept that his guys killed some people in cold blood. But that is known. I mean, there's Confederate testimony to that effect. We just don't know how many. It could have been 10 people. It could have been 100. It was nowhere near the total casualty list of 300 because, as I say, they'd been fighting all day, and then there was an assault. And then as the garrison retreated, there was an ambush right next to the river down there. And as to who died where and when, nobody knows anymore. And the congressional committee that met that summer only took testimony from those people who had been wounded and who had been turned over to Union custody. They were grievously wounded. And so, therefore, there were their doctor and a couple of other people managed to escape and testify as well. But there was never any real attempt to get to the bottom. The congressional testimony was primarily election propaganda. There were over 40,000 copies of the report sent out right before the election of 1864. as to bolster the Republican cause. Really, I mean that's what happened. Inquiries after the war kind of led more to things like this happen in war, and no one was ever prosecuted.
Changing the subject, what was the most brilliant example of Forrest's generalship?
In terms of on the battlefield itself, Bryce's Crossroads was in June 10th, 1864. He met with something like 4,500 people total, most of which didn't arrive on the battlefield until later in the day. He met and defeated a mixed, experienced force of cavalry and infantry and artillery of over 7,000. And he managed to not only defeat them, he captured their artillery and many of their personnel. I mean, but it was a close run thing. And there are things out there there are people out there that say, well, he had planned this the whole way and he had outsmarted the guy. But I think part of it was his guys fought well, and the Union forces were mishandled pretty severely. Now, as far as his impact on the war, these are lesser known things. The behind Buell's lines that I already talked about in 1862, I think, had the effect of delaying the outcome of the year, of the war for a year. And another one that happened in February of 64, before Fort Pillow, Sherman was hoping to move all the way into Alabama, take Selma, and then take Mobile from behind. But Forrest defeated his cavalry force under Sooy Smith, and even though he was outnumbered 2-1, and sent Sooy Smith running back to Memphis, and that's basically saved not only Mobile, the port of Mobile, but a lot of the fertile land that was feeding Joe Johnston's army in Mississippi, and his army was in Georgia, but the fertile land that was feeding him was in Mississippi and Alabama, and it saved that land from destruction. Sherman had planned to do something like his march through Georgia as early as February of 1864 by cutting across Mississippi and Alabama. And it came to naught because Forrest defeated his cavalry, and Sherman did not feel good about going forward.
Was Forrest ever considered for a larger command?
The largest command he ever had was he had command of all the cavalry in Mississippi, Alabama, and East Louisiana in 1865. That amounted to 10,000 people. However, because there were 6 different Union threats from 6 different directions, so he had to disperse his men. Also it was winter, so he had to feed them, and you had to disperse them to feed them. But he had to disperse his men and could never concentrate them. The most he ever had in his command concentrated was during the Nashville campaign. He started off with between 5,000 and 6,000 cavalry. He was never considered for higher command. He didn't have the quote advantages, unquote. He could read, but his writing was terrible. He had no self-confidence in his writing. His method of talking, his accent, the words that he chose to use were backcountry, and therefore a lot of people discounted him because of that.
It's more than 150 years after the Civil War. Why is it important to study the battle and campaigns of General Forrest?
Well, I think there's a lot to be learned in terms of not tactics per se. Obviously, tactics have evolved quite a bit. But if you think about the next level above tactics, which is in the Army nowadays, is called operational art. Operational art really hasn't changed at the ground combat level. Now, obviously, we have air and naval forces quite a bit more integrated and nowadays. But in terms of ground maneuver at the higher level, not in contact with the enemy, but to shape what's going on, there's a lot that can be learned from the Civil War written large in operational art. The forms of maneuver have not changed. If you look at, say, Desert Storm, the plan, General Frank's plan, looks pretty much like, say, the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863. There's a lot to be learned from that. Now, in terms of Forrest in particular, I think you can learn not his detailed tactics, but more of some of what you might call his maxims. Is when, for instance, he would say, and I'm going to use a little bit of his vernacular, when you see the enemy, give them a dare. What that means is hit them as soon as you see them. Why? You're establishing that you're on the initiative. You're making him, the enemy, think that there's more of you there than there probably are, and be a little bit wary. When you got him on the run, keep the scare on. Obviously pursuit. He would say, hit them on the end, which is nothing more than what we call an envelopment. He maneuvered against the enemy's rear. Now, why is all this important? War is fundamentally a matter of human will. That's the real basis. Now, what do you think the soldiers would think? They're sitting here fighting Forrest cavalry, and they already know he's got a reputation as a brilliant commander. And then suddenly you hear firing from an unexpected direction, maybe even behind you. What's the moral effect on you and your comrades? Well, number one, you're afraid to get that, hey, they're behind us, or they're from an unexpected place. We may be surrounded. We don't want to be surrounded. We don't want to have to surrender. And the second part of that thought is, how did they get back there? This guy we're facing is obviously a lot smarter than my commander is, because my commander let them surround us. That loss of confidence is the morale factor is the most important component. And he understood the human tendency to be afraid, and he took advantage of it at every opportunity. And that, I think, is the tactical lesson that you would learn from Forrest.
The name of the book, The Battles and Campaigns of Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, the author, General John Scales. General Scales, thank you very much for being on Connor's Corner.
Thank you. I'm honored to be asked about the book.